Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for this evening's book club, which is about the book Doctors by Jonathan Gathorne-Hardy. I'd like to welcome my co-host today, Dr. Mahana Javed and Dr. Fahim Shukru.
Hello. Hello, everybody.
So, in terms of the book, it's mostly about nostalgia for me. Nostalgia for a gilded past rules a roost in modern discourse. So it seems fitting that the grandson of a Victorian Earl, Jonathan Gathorne-Hardy, who sadly died last year, should be the author of today's book. His grandfather was an earl, and to this day that earldom is extant. His father had a failed Harvey Street practice. His mother invested unwisely. His most famous book laments past glories. Some may find it anathema for one not schooled in medicine to have the audacity to write about GPs. Hence, this book lies in relative obscurity. We live in a time when there is a plethora of GP programs and shows. My esteemed co-hosts themselves have a burgeoning YouTube and podcast channel that reflects the time and moment. As we find in the book, Dr. Blair Hall feels that GPs enjoy amateur dramatics and role play, and I think my co-host Fahim would agree that doctors are hot viewing right now. This book gives an account from a time when this was not quite the case, though. It is telling that the stories told and discussion had with the GPs are reminiscent of a time before political correctness. When I read this book, it made me appreciate the position of senior GPs and the issues they had with modern general practice. It is fair to say that the loss of prestige to partners and the rise of locum work has been revolutionary and one that I suspect is unsustainable. But for those that have lived this change, resentment, and some remorse. We've dedicated, whether fully realizing or not, the next 30 years or so of our lives towards medicine and general practice. This book enlightened the journey of general practice from apothecary in the 1800s to its present format. After all, general practice in the UK holds a cultural significance to the people of this land. Everyone has a GP. They may not have a surgeon or a cardiologist or a psychiatrist to call their own, but they have a GP. Every Briton will have their own experience of their GP. And if our patients were to put pen to paper, then dare I say, it would either be a hatchet job and hagiography account in unequal measure. The author's style is relaxed. One could spend years reading this book to create moments of idyll, but also when faced with a situation, consult the book for some solace. I admire his perseverance in traversing the land to distill these stories and create his narrative. His own admission of sympathy for his father's plight is only natural given the steps he took to empathy. The author's personal losses and childhood challenges are laid out in the book. His chosen topics are revealing given he addresses stress, moral dilemmas, and family issues. I would argue that the last chapter in the book is his catharsis, where he finally puts these to bed. Harkening back to the obscurity of this book, I feel responsibility for this lies with both the subject matter and the competition it faces. Maybe if a time does arise when GPs once more enter the realm of the unknown, then this book may well gain some currency. The book does not inspire, but clears the mist of perspiration around general practice in the 80s, when their habits and wares were less understood. His prophecies relating to GPs have in some ways borne fruit, but mass unemployment has not. Maybe as GPs in 2020, this is a point for reflection. Withered nostalgia, or is it withered nostalgia? The book created a vision of a charm that may have existed in general practice, but that by the type of work and the issues in particular for patient outcomes makes me appreciate our situation today. So I've said my part. I will let my co-hosts elaborate further on their feelings and thoughts on the book.
Thank you for that, Zubair. I certainly don't think my account will be as eloquent as that, but it's certainly an interesting book. This is an author who died at the age of 86, so I think he passed away last year, didn't he? And he's interestingly, he's done many different books. I think he must be about 20 plus. He's wrote novels, he's wrote short stories, he's even done children's book. But we're here today discussing the book called Doctors because I guess, lo and behold, we're all doctors and trying to see if it does have relevance and value. I found it quite an interesting book. I'm obviously a psychiatrist from background, but general practice isn't that far away from the realms of psychiatry. It was certainly an interesting book, 303 pages. I didn't think it was easy at times to read, but we will certainly discuss that further. But this is clearly an author who's lived a very colourful life, and he tries to bring the value of general practice through this book. I think something that does resonate, and it's still quite valuable today, is that he does say that 90% of referrals to hospitals could be managed on general practice if you have the relevant funding and the relevant support. So, you know, we can certainly argue whether 90% is a correct value, but certainly with greater focus on community care, I think those kind of services would certainly be able to better manage, patient care as well as the subsequent impact on NHS. So yeah, so I found it quite an interesting book, and I know Fahim's got similar but sometimes different views on this. What are your thoughts, Fahim?
I didn't expect to be introduced so early on, but okay. Happy to do that. Yeah, thanks, Zubair, for choosing this book. Thanks, Mehran, for the introductory comments. Yeah, it's interesting is one word to describe the book. So this book was obscure to me. It was a revelation in that I'd never heard of the book or the author. But obviously with a good book club, it's important to get to the grips with the book. The book is interesting. I think we should talk a little bit about the actual content and the chapters. We've not delved into that so much. So there's about 40 chapters from memory, and some of the chapters deal with specific doctors that this gentleman has interviewed. Not every doctor gets a chapter, although I'm not sure how that is actually devised, the actual ranking system of who gets a chapter and who gets just a partial chapter. But that's sort of interesting to know, just so the audience is aware. So he makes his interviews, he talks about tapes. It's not clear how this is actually done, the recording, but I guess some tape recordings are done, and he makes notes, he talks about them, and they're written up pretty much verbatim. It's set in obviously a time before the 80s. It was published in the 80s, but it's leading up to that. So you've got an interesting mix of doctors that I don't think fully represents the society of doctors there. I was reading up on the case, and in the 80s, from what I gather, there were 4,000 doctors from the Asian subcontinent in the UK. I'm not sure how many are in this book, perhaps 1 out of the 40 or 50. So at a percentage level, it's not portraying, societal picture of that time. It does provide, however, as Zubair said clearly, his narrative, and that's what's here. His narrative is obviously what the GP does, the actual things that they undertake. As Zubair eloquently put, nostalgia. There's definitely a lot of nostalgia there as to how it used to be, the respect of the doctor, the role in society, what they undertake, how that's changing in their lifetime, how they interact with other partners. I think it's fair to say in terms of general practice, it focuses a lot on the partner system, whereas perhaps now the model has changed with the salary doctors and locums a lot more. But it does focus on partners, and there's a lot more single partners at that stage. It's quite clear when you talk and look back now, and I think that's disintegrating for various reasons. Some is CQC regulation and other causes, but the book I found interesting was it actually tells you a lot more of what the single GP was doing, the single practice GP, and the clientele that they were facing. I know you've got a lot of questions about it, but I think just to set the scene that we're going to get through them. But yeah, at least people know what the book's about, these interviews, and then they're sort of cherry picked and put together in some sort of a fashion to make about 40 chapters. And by the end of it, hopefully you've got some idea of this gentleman's narrative of what general practice was leading up to the 1980s.
Thank you, Fahim. So what we'll do is we'll crack on with the discussion points and hopefully try and tease out some of the things that we thought were important to us, and maybe not, sometimes important to us also from the book, and hopefully important for the viewers in terms of determining whether or not they would read the book themselves or recommend it to others. As always, we always try and talk something positive. So we'll start off with what we like best about this book. Shall I let Fahim, do you want to come in first with that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. What I liked best about this book was that it was no holds barred. So I'm not fond of expletives or other kind of language, but he has included some of the doctors in what they say verbatim, how they feel. So there's a rawness to it, authenticity to the actual narrative which is portrayed. Whether I agree or not, we can come to it later, but you can't disagree with what someone said in terms of their feelings.
Yeah.
So I like the authenticity of what he's saying. I like the breadth of it, because there are other books that talk about doctors' experiences. We'll come on to that. But his, it's around about 50 or so, looking at the bibliography. And he's actually done a bit of research into the consultation model. I like that. So even though he's not a doctor himself, I like the fact that he's taken the trouble to understand how a doctor consults, some of the mechanics behind that, and he's familiarized himself with that process in order to critique perhaps some of the doctors in their own work, but actually to give a critique of the work. These are the things that I think are best about the book.
Thank you, Fahim. I think for me personally, there was a lot to kind of distill with regards to what I found enjoyable about the book. I think we've all got different thoughts about what's most topical for us as GPs or within society nowadays. But for me, what's topical within the book and what I think for him was the essence was basically his chapter on stress. You find that the chapter on stress was the longest within the book itself. And the bit that kind of jumped out at me was the 80-year rule he mentioned within that chapter. Because when I was training, my trainer told me about the 7-year rule, that when you become a GP, after 7 years, you'll get burnt out. So you need to prepare for that eventuality. So I thought it was interesting to see how the perception then was 8 years, but as time's gone on, it's become 7 years. And I guess maybe my colleagues nowadays probably argue it's less than that, but I'm not sure. And he kind of really breaks it down and actually talks about the causes for these things. He talks about the endless giving that GPs do, which I think is a fair comment. He talks about the job being physically taxing, which I guess in the year of doing multiple visits, as in 15 visits per day, weekends, etc., must have been very physically taxing. I don't know how much that is a physical issue nowadays. However, for me, the biggest thing probably was the anxiety creating situation. So all those unknowns that we deal with, all the things that are unexpected that we deal with in general practice that we face nowadays, especially when you add on to that the issue around litigation that we have that kind of confronts us. He talks about arranging things and frustration around arranging things, and I'm sure Meher probably disagree with me, but we tend to have a lot of frustration with certain specialities in terms of getting someone seen to and getting their advice. I know the conflict thing was important. So he talks about conflict with patients when patients want some things and we sort of say, no, you can't have that medication or you can't have that referral. Because I know within my own practice, we have, and I've met other clinicians too, who struggle with saying no to patients, especially when they want something, because you tend to find that patients come with you with a problem and you give them the solution. But when they come with you with the solution and then actually saying, no, that's not the right one, when they're quite keen that that solution that they provided is the right one, is quite difficult. He then obviously talks greatly about how the GPs in those days coped with their stress, or mentioning things like squash or families and whatever. But it made me reflect on what I do and how I've managed my emotions with regards to work. Because I mean, I've been a GP now for almost over 10 years now. So obviously kind of after a while, I should have hit the 7-year mark already. And I probably argued that something I probably have burnt out at certain parts in that time. But I find that obviously I don't know what you guys use, but it's a case of talking with the colleagues and talking to family, and actually talking things in more of a less in a more deep manner as opposed to the superficial manner which traditionally was done. As you know, you guys and we've done 10k runs before, and I always find that useful. And when we stopped doing that, I find obviously in terms of the weight size increasing, but in terms of the stress level, that did increase thereafter. Obviously, we have our own faith and spiritual exercises with regards to that. That's always been useful. But recently, we've done things within the book that we didn't do consciously, which is using things like cuddles and talking to each other with complex cases a bit more than we did do previously. And that's actually interesting because some of the GPs there did do these things, but as a practice, we hadn't done that for quite some time. And although historically it was done, we kind of forgot, and it's become a thing again. So hence why I was saying before we came on air about how there are things within the book that we might find irrelevant, but actually when we read it, we think actually we just reinvented the wheel here. We were doing this 30 years ago and we stopped doing it, and now we're doing it again. So that for me was one of the biggest things that came out of the book, that whole chapter, because it let me actually delve into the actual author. I know Mehran mentioned he's written a lot of books. This is just one of those. And his other books, where he actually does an autobiography, talks about his father and his Harley Street practice and the difficulties his father faced in terms of his practice, but then also in his personal life. And you find that I find that when he's written this book, he's tried to figure out why his father did what he did do and his behavior in that time. So I know you probably won't read the book, but if you ever do read his autobiography, you might find that actually some of the stuff he said here makes a bit more sense because he's actually talking about his dad and what happened there. Mehran, anything for yourself?
Yeah, and I think, as soon as you open the book and start reading, he does say in memory of my dear father, Anthony, who he can clearly sympathize and relate to following his journey. It is, as both of you mentioned various things, that's good about this book. I think there is obviously that richness, as you said, picking out those statements, and it does give you a clear kind of snapshot in what life was like during the 80s. There was a lot of conflicts, let's say, with social care and people with social workers about capacity and around consent. It was a very, difficult thing to approach, and I guess even today it can be quite challenging. But at least we have some clear foundations and some clear guidance that we can certainly use to promote someone's independence and supporting them through their journey. So I certainly think there's a lot of it there, and he's given certain chapters to specific GPs. You can tell he has got on well with certain GPs, whether it's suburban or very inner city GPs. And I'm not sure how much time he spent, but I think it's about a week, give or take, with each GP. So there's a lot of effort. You're looking at 40 plus GPs, I think. So to get that, organize it, and everything else, and he covers a vast number of topics, even relevant today, whether it's about euthanasia, about unemployment, and certainly there are opportunities that he can delve in further, but nevertheless he made a point that they were still relevant back in those days, and it does give me some insight into, I think, and towards the latter stages of the book, it talks about 75% of GP would probably vote Tory. So certainly the political angle was talked about. I'm not sure whether that's the case today, but that's another argument for another day. But it's interesting. You talked about keeping ourselves not sane, but at least keeping the levels of energy, the contentment, the spirit, the concentration. Doing 10k runs, I can clearly say all three of us have very different techniques of doing that 10k. Especially for him, who it's HIIT training, but for him But he did make it, and he had a big beaming smile like he has currently when he did finish the 10K, compared to you and Isabel. But yeah,
He was very much the tortoise, wasn't he?
Yeah. But no, I think there's value, and I think we talked about last time how much books revered, how much of value can a book have. It's very difficult to say that a book doesn't have value. I think every book does have value. It's whether you can relate to it at that moment in time with whatever's going on in your mind. But I certainly thought it was very insightful.
Thank you, Mehran. So in terms of the next question, so we always go from good to bad. What do we find was the least favorable thing about this book? Do you want to start with that, Mehran?
Yeah. So I think we had a bit of a debrief previously, didn't we? And it's interesting. We all come from slightly different angles. Be kind. Yeah. But if I look at the topics, clearly the thing about overseas GPs, I think I got a little bit riled up. That was, I think, chapter 25, and you could clearly see that. I'm not sure how he chose that GP. First of all, we still don't know how he comes to that decision about getting specific people in general practice involved in this book. But that specific GP pretty much moaned about his own community, as well as money being the forefront of his discussion. I think later on we found out how money was his kind of common denominator in terms of topics to discuss with people, especially if he can't relate to someone. And sometimes you just naturally delve into that kind of topic. So I thought there was a lot of opportunities, and it also talked a little bit about the subconscious bias. So when we talk about racism, whether it's conscious or subconscious, I think there was clear elements of how certain GPs chose candidates in terms of working in their practice. So I thought there was an opportunity missed, but also kind of losing that value, that richness, because I think that was probably at the beginning of where you had a regular influx where, the NHS as well as community service was supported by people of BAME backgrounds. So, yeah, those were some of the bits that I certainly didn't enjoy.
I think that's a fair comment, Mehran, with regards to what he'd done in terms of that particular chapter and with that particular GP as well. Because that was a criticism that we all had in terms of the lack of representation. I will obviously discuss that in detail, hopefully soon. I'll let Vaim come in, then I'll say my least favorite part.
Yeah. Yeah, where can I start? So
just one thing.
So I think there were several things wrong with this book, which makes it difficult to read. Without dwelling too much on the BAME issue, which we'll come on to, that's one. There's also a lot of casual racism in the book. So chapter 7, they pose problems, the Asians. Why should they pose problems, the Asians? So one of the GP, and at certain stages, the author corrects or at least tries to put an alternate view in his interviews, but not on that occasion. He didn't. And then also, there's other chapters where they're actually looked quite frowned upon. They talk about a Jamaican doctor, and if he was to leave, then the white doctor would get all of his patients. Well, why should that happen? That's a big assumption. So they're actually reinforcing some stereotypes and some quite racist undertones in this book, which I didn't like, and it's quite unsettling. Given a couple of examples there's actually more littered throughout the book. So it's an uncomfortable read, I think, particularly if you're from a BAME background. So that's why I can't recommend it to a BAME GP at all, really, because it's uncomfortable reading. Other things that weren't so good, I mentioned at the beginning, was really the way the chapters are just brought apart. There's no link how he goes from one to talk about finance, to talk about partnerships, to another doctor's name. I couldn't see a structure to how the chapters are coming along one by the other. I'm just looking, they're just numbered to me, 1, 2, 6, 10, 12, 25. There's at the end, there was no reasoning how he did that. So I think on that level, and just maybe the style of writing, I think it's just I know as part of the book club we try and learn a few phrases and styles, but the ones I'm left with are the actual racist undertones that I'm left, which haven't been tackled. But I can't remember any memorable lines from the book or insights. I know what the book's about. I've read the book. I know what the topics are, what he's trying to do. But is there a line I could quote to someone and say this is there isn't a line I could say that was really memorable in the book? And for me, that's an obvious disadvantage of it.
Thank you, Faye. So, I mean, for me, obviously, this is a book that I'd been made familiar with by my trainer when I was training. So hence why I kind of put it to the attention of the team, because quite clearly it was a book that isn't very well known. And I think we probably realize why that's the case. I do think it has value though, and I guess we've discussed that previously. But in terms of what I least liked about the book, I think I mentioned this in my initial spiel, was in essence it's because it's his narrative. So even though the actual book is about doctors in their own words and their lives, he actually doesn't quite say in their own words. He kind of gives his own narrative, and it seems to be the case that it actually goes through the book and it's more cathartic for him than actually revealing anything about the lives of GPs. And that's probably why it has an element of dissatisfaction when it is read by doctors and GPs, because you think, well, actually, what I've actually learned when I've read the book. But I do get your point with regards to the other issues, so we will address that hopefully soon. We'll just go on to the next point, Mehran. So we were just hopefully going to discuss whether it made us kind of helped us as a GP or as a doctor, or whether it made us reflect on our practice. I've mentioned a few things about for myself with regards to stress and the fact that there are things in there with regards to having discussions with your colleagues and having huddles and that sort of thing, and how the issue of superficial counselling is the term I would use from doctors generally and also nowadays, and that's why there's a constant issue around stress and burnout. And I think that's still relevant to our present practice as it used to be historically. I did like the sort of part where he talks about why people became GPs in the first place, because it's always nice to know why somebody becomes a doctor. It's always been a curiosity for me. Why did you become a doctor in the first place? Why did you decide to dedicate your whole life to this noble profession, if you want to call it that, but quite taxing profession? And it was nice to kind of see how the others came through. It didn't bring anything revelatory for me. It just reinforced some of the reasons why I became a GP or a doctor in the first place. I must confess that I never set out to be a GP at the age of 18. I thought I'd be a cardiologist like Fame's brother, but it didn't quite work out that way. But I'm still obviously with GPs now, and it's been a fruitful and pleasant 9 years. So for me, it was helpful in terms of those aspects. He obviously brings out things with regards to his narrative, like I mentioned, but it's always been a curiosity of mine to actually tease out the collective nous and knowledge of GPs, because there are a lot of doctors who have practiced in this country and who have got nuggets of inspiration or anecdotes of wisdom which aren't being passed on, which have kind of gone with them to the grave, so to speak. He detailed a few things. For example, he talks about sinusitis, looking at your feet and those sort of things, but there's a vast array of different things that GPs come across in their practice. Little nuggets, there might not be many, but there's sufficient enough that if they were collated, I think would really enrich practice for budding GPs or GPs that practice nowadays. And that for me is something that the books makes me always consider, that I always think that there's a big unmet need there. And so that's really what I took out of it for myself. For yourselves, did it help you guys, or is it not really helped you at all?
Do you want to start with that one, Fame?
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's helped in the way that obviously he talks about some of the pressures, I think, in terms of pharmaceutical companies. I think that's still relevant now as it was then in prescriptions, and how a prescription can help to satisfy the patient. I think that's still quintessentially an issue now that can actually be remembered. In some ways, it helped me, as in, after this, I found out about the representation issue, and then I found another book which does do that, and that's called The Migrants Architects of the NHS South Asian Doctors and the Reinvention of the British General Practice, written in 2018. And that actually gives a fuller color of the actual diaspora and who actually came to the UK to make the NHS. So in a way, this book didn't help me, but it helped me to get to where I wanted to, because I then realized there's another book which is better than this, which actually explores GPs and their experiences in a full way, with better research and better quality. So the lure to get that came from being unfulfilled by this book. So because it's like an unmet need, or so to speak, I wasn't fulfilled by this, but then I thought someone else probably did a book that did fulfill me, and I was right. There was another book. So in that sense, it helped me. It helped me just to see the issues that the doctors have had over the ages, in terms of issues with their colleagues, issues with misdiagnosis or delayed diagnosis, the things that will still trouble doctors now. So it helped in that sense. But mainly it helped me to know where I'm not wanting to go and where I can go.
Thank you, Faye.
Yeah, I think following up on that, I think it's, as I said before, every book has value to it. And I was alluding to the fact that earlier that there's lots of topics within this book that still resonates today, and it just makes me realize that we haven't addressed the issue. He talks about unemployment. He talks about the elderly, not just about the ongoing issues with regards to people who are getting old, but also the actual workforce. Some of the terminology, some of the things that people have said during those interviews are quite difficult to digest, to be honest. It's very ageist, but I think you could argue that's the merit in how he's reported it. He's actually literally written what has been said, so as not to sugarcoat it or minimize some of the true kind of feelings that exist in society, as well as the kind of medical fraternity at the time. I certainly, it's made me realize that everyone in the medical profession does have valuable opportunities and contacts. Everyone has a story to tell. Some people are better at saying it than others. That's ultimately it. And everyone's contentment or drive can be slightly different. I guess we're sitting here on a Sunday evening talking about a book, as well as talking various other topics. So I think our interest is an example of how things have evolved. At the same time, we haven't shied away from it. I think it's kind of our own kind of development and understanding, so that we can improve the current as well as the future situation. But certainly it gives a good insight as to how things were before.
Yeah, I think you've both mentioned quite eloquently with regards to the uncomfortable phrases and messages within the book. But again, I do stress that this is the time before political correctness. And I guess it may give us an idea of what it was like for those GPs and doctors who were practicing in the 70s and the 80s, and the challenges they faced if they came from a BME background. Just a quick yes or no. Is the book relevant to us nowadays, you guys? Quick yes or no?
No.
Oh, Mehran?
Probably not, no.
Excellent. And in quick one again, do you think GPs are a worthy subject for a book? Do you think GPs in general, just as the hoi polloi, are a worthy subject for a book?
It's very difficult to say they're not. That's the thing. I don't want to be seen as someone who's just kind of dismissed a profession, because a lot of my interactions, as well as my both my social circle as well as family, are from the general practice world. So yes, I think everyone's got a story to tell. It's just that's the key thing for me.
Yeah, I think so. As I said before, I think they are, and it was written 2 years ago, the book that needed to be told. Migrant Architects of the NHS, South Asian Doctors and the Reinvention of British GP. So yes, it is a worthy subject, and it's been told. Excellent.
So I know we've had some passionate views about the book itself when we discussed things a week or so ago. And I know right now we're in July, and that we've had different things happening across the world. So we thought we'd let if Fahim wants to come into this section with regards to BLM, would that be okay, Fahim?
Yeah, no, I think obviously what happened 26th of May, isn't it, with the death, and then obviously the Black Lives Matter movement is everywhere. I think, as I was saying off the air with you both, that that's the room that's burning, and that's really the main issue at the moment topically around the world. And I think that's a lens or a perspective or a frame of reference that should be seen everywhere in everything we're doing. And so perhaps we need to bring that narrative into here. So that's why when that phrases and phraseology was used about perhaps Black doctors negatively, it made me feel even worse about the book. Okay, and I think we can sugarcoat and say before political correctness, but we know something's wrong when it's wrong. I think, we can try and defend the indefensible, but sometimes if something's blatantly wrong, it's wrong. And the fact that the persons, like I said, when they were saying things which are absolutely grossly wrong or disgusting, weren't tackled or challenged, that's the part of the issue, because that perpetuates the racism in a way. If at least he had said, oh yeah, and I didn't agree, because at parts he does disagree, and he makes commentary on the doctors sometimes. He actually talks about one of the doctors saying that, I don't think they're a good GP. So he's made that summary himself without having been a patient, but watching them, they're quite impatient. I don't think they're a good GP. So if we can make that comment about impatience and personal qualities, but you can't when you make statements against Black or Asian people, then I think in some ways that says something about the author and how they perceive the doctors. In terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and so on, obviously, it just heightens the awareness of like giving opportunities to that. This sort of book obviously does not give the opportunities to such doctors, and other books have done that. So I think in that sense, it's something that we should all remember. It's the room that's on fire, and we're all doing different things to try and actually promote that issue in whatever fields we can, either professionally or personally. And really, that's a duty on all of us.
But Fahim, if let's say, for example, he was still alive and you read this book, what would you do? Would you say that this is filled with crass commentary, racist undertones or overtones, however you want to phrase it, and it shouldn't be promoted and disbanded in terms of from circulation? Well, how would you approach that issue? Because when we talk about correctness and some we are ignorant. I guess that's in terms of the foundation. We are ignorant unless we find ourselves in a situation where we develop further insight.
I think there's some merit in that. It's also, we've seen a lot of apologies come out in the last few weeks for things that happened decades ago, perhaps. So why do someone apologize now and not a decade ago, unless it's heightened? So if he was still alive, I'd ask him to think, do you think any of that was right? I'd just, I like contacting people. I'd probably email him and say, look, I didn't like these phrases. What do you think of them? Do you think the doctors who said them were out of order? If so, what did you do about it at the time? That's all, really. And I think from that you get it, because over the last few weeks, there've been a lot of famous apologies for people who have either done things like blacking up or making comments or things that they knew were wrong at that time, but because it's brought into that, and there may be also a financial benefit or incentive for them to break, there may be sponsors and other things who are forcing people to make apologies. But those are some of the issues I would think has been happening. I think people know in themselves, in their gut conscience, if something's right or not. I think generally people do with a moral compass.
Thank you, Fahim. I think we're going to obviously talk about another book next month, which I think Mehran has highlighted, which I hope will hopefully give us the opportunity to explore those issues more, because I think I would, for my own self, probably say that the issues that have been raised over the past month, even though I may have read things and heard of individuals who are involved with certain struggles over the years, I still need to learn about it myself personally. So obviously from a sort of Asian perspective, that's certainly it's not an issue, but intrinsically that is what we are. But obviously from the sort of Afro-Caribbean or Black perspective, that's something that obviously for me is another area of that needs to be developed further. But thank you for that, Fahim. I think it was important to mention, and that's why we made sure that we gave the opportunity for that to be explored. I think what would be useful is on the next slide, Mehran, we've obviously got the BME issue, that, and obviously it's not exactly BLM issue, but if we can bring up the next slide, maybe just make a comment or two about that part, because there is a chapter within the book about overseas doctors, and Fahim's mentioned this already, and it was uncomfortable to read. Obviously, my parents weren't overseas doctors. I know, obviously, Mehran, your parents obviously had that experience, so I'm not sure whether they had issues themselves when they came here. But it was revelatory to see his perception that the issue was more about their training as opposed to who they were, and that the children of these doctors, so that's basically you, Mehran, would come out and be great doctors themselves. I think that was a bit condescending. It didn't sit well with me when I read it. The issue is, was the fact that not enough Asian doctors were part of the book a fault? Because he basically says in his initial spiel that he did contact BME doctors, but they weren't as forthcoming. So there's only this Dr. Rushdie who came forward, but all the others shied away. Should he have made more of an effort? And in general, do we find that over the years we have less representation of BME doctors in books? And if we feel that's the case, should that be remedied, and how can it be remedied? We know about certain authors nowadays that are going to be coming forward. I know we talked off air about how difficult it was for them to kind of get a publisher, and how many Instagram followers and all sorts they had to do to get published. But if in general, is there an issue with regards to BME doctor representation in books and in journals? And if so, how can this be remedied? Do you guys have any particular thoughts on that issue?
I just wanted to just follow on something that you said just in your commentary just now, Zubair. There was obviously that Dr. Rushdie who came forward, and with every aspect of migration, there's obviously that degree of assimilation, that aspect of accommodation to make sure that you integrate, but also society in itself integrates with one another. He's obviously, I'm assuming it's a he, he's put his hand up and wants to be involved in this book, but you can tell from the get-go that he was making negative comments towards his own community. He had 3 Pakistani families on his GP register, and some of the terms he used was maddening. Clearly the worst patients that he had, and if your own community and someone of some degree of professional standing is saying that about your own community, what hope do you have of someone who's trying to understand that community coming up with a better insight? So I think some of the difficulties are self-perpetuated, and we have to be mindful of that. It may be that he, to fit in, you mock your own community. We've seen clearly some evidence of that when we interact with some other people. And obviously the base, the Black Lives Matter movement is completely on a different level. It's about justice, about right, about equality, nothing of which he kind of really brought out. But we're assuming everything he said was captured in this book. So just kind of bringing that element about Dr. Rushdie. In terms of underrepresentation in books itself, for us to talk about it in a very niche area being medical books, I just think we have to think about it in a just general education perspective. Someone who is in primary care, how many of the main characters are of BME background? I think The Guardian had an article that was done about 1 or 2 years ago, which was 1%, which is really not representative of the the color or the in terms of the ethnicity that exists in this country. So I think if we start early, if we start to raise some of the issues so that people are more comfortable talking about it from a young age, not just children and how they understand it, but also teachers, and supporting them to make sure that they cover all aspects of the community and society itself. I think that's probably a bigger question to ask. But that's my perspective.
Thank you, Mehran. Faye, any comments on that aspect for you, or are you coming there?
Yeah, I think what I'd say is I'm going to recite a few names, and I'll let you guys tell me what the names represent. Dr. Abdurazi Sedgi, Dr. Mohinder Singh Dutt, Dr. Purnima Nair, Dr. Karamat Ullah Mirza, Dr. Saad Al Dubaisi, Dr. Yusuf Ismail Patel, Dr. Craig Wakeham, Dr. Krishan Arora, Dr. Kamlesh Mason, Dr. Fayez Ayachi, Dr. Syed Zishan Haider, Dr. Habib Zaidi. Do you know who they are?
Victims of the virus.
Exactly. So these are the 12 GPs who died of the coronavirus. Nearly all, I think except one, Craig, are from a BME background. So BME issue should be at the forefront of our minds because there was a clap today. It's the 72nd NHS birthday today. There was another clap made at 5 p.m. The BMA Council Chairman also made it an issue to mention at the Sky interview today about BME deaths. I think over 90% of the doctors and approximately 60% of healthcare workforce. So they've given their lives to the NHS. But you wouldn't know it from this book, would you, that they'd done that? So there may be new books where it talks about the deaths from the pandemic. They may be yet to be written. And then I think at that stage, they would appear. I know I've said it a couple of times, but in some ways, this redress was long overdue. In the 2018 book by Julian Simpson, he redresses this injustice, and it was given a great gala reception by the Royal College of General Practitioners in 2018 with a lot of overseas media coverage. And he talks to 40 GPs, 3 children of GPs, and 2 NHS politicians, basically 45 people. So in that way, other people have tried to redress it. But in order to get it redressed, there were some differences in the authors. That author had shared French and British citizenship. He spent part of his time in, I think, West Africa as well. And therefore, as part of his prologue, he said, this made me interested in the overseas doctors. You now contrast that to this author, as you mentioned, Zubair, very eloquently, from an Earl background. And what do we mention all the time in the book? This person is from this middle class background, from this working class background. Class is mentioned nearly every other sentence in this book. It's important to the author. He could have omitted it. He could have, but he kept bringing it because I know he's from a higher class. He's an Earl or Earl background, right? To him, it's important. So in terms of relating it back to this sort of thing, it's about what's you hold dear and what's important to you. So yes, he may have tried to reach out to some doctors, but then like you said, should you do more? Well, if they're having victimization, if they're having racism, if they're having some sort of injustice faced, you're less likely to put yourself forward. So I think it's a case of trying to write these narratives, get more from those backgrounds who are well written, and it's coming up. We see them in the BMJ blogs, which I share with you both, and other things. There are some who are actually writing this, but there is a cost to them. Some of them actually find that not all the reaction is positive necessarily. So it comes at a cost at which point in your career you wish to do this, I find.
Yeah. Excellent. I think it's been difficult, hasn't it? The angle within the book. I do hope that having read the book, though, it does give us the opportunity to consider, because it's an obscure book, as I mentioned before, but I think it gives us the opportunity to think how things were. I'm really glad that Fahim did bring up that book, and I hope that we can maybe put that in the comment section at the end with regards to the 2018 book. It had quite a long title, so I couldn't quite memorize it. But hopefully we can drag that down.
That's a good book. Yeah.
Have you read it yet?
Yeah, it's a really good book.
Okay. I've not read it, so we'll have to. That's good that we've obviously discussed this today, so I can have a look. We've obviously discussed the issue about Bill and BME, hopefully in some detail, because I think that was important to kind of bring forward. I thought what we'd do is, going off on that, should we just ask this question about, in general, do medical books become irrelevant? I mean, we always quote Avicenna's book of his canon that was the staple of medical schools for, I think, 7 centuries or so. But no doctor has read that book who practices, I believe, for the past 2 centuries, because it no longer is taught in medical schools. But you might argue that book is irrelevant. I don't know. But in general, do medical books become irrelevant, or do they always have some value? So would this book always hold value? Maybe not for the right reasons, but maybe for the wrong reasons. or actually is it a case of certain books, they've been written and they never have any relevance and they have no value, and we should just basically chuck them in the scrap heap of history? Just wanted to get your thoughts on that issue, really, from both of you.
I think books in general, it's very difficult to argue that they're irrelevant. I guess to what value do they have is certainly a different question. Because I think it's how, as with every, let's say if you do a research study, it's how you understand your context, how you apply a methodology and actually carry it out will kind of highlight how high up the list of your priorities that book needs to be, and for you to understand that certain topic. I certainly don't think this book specifically is a must read for someone in general practice. It certainly doesn't really apply to me coming from a psychiatry background, but for me to say it's irrelevant, it's very difficult for me to say that. I do certainly think that if it was to be done again, the number and the variation, as well as actually having a clear understanding of what topics need to be covered. I think things were done slightly back to front in this topic, so in this book. So things like unemployment or other areas such as overseas GPs, these are very important societal topics, as well as issues that we're always going to face and trying to understand the value of it and address it, but it doesn't come out, and in terms of any kind of detail, understanding and underpinnings. Maybe the kind of research and the information wasn't available back in the 80s. I don't know. We've obviously got a lot more understanding use of technology, so that certainly helped us address those issues, or at least try to address them anyway. So that's my take on the irrelevance bit.
Yeah. For him, do you think in general medical books some become irrelevant, or do they always have some value?
Yeah, I think they have value in at least telling you about how things were at that point in time. So they're valuable in the sense of as a historical context as to how things were being done, and even just as a good historian may not agree with everything, but it tells you what's going on, and that's where this book, it tells you what things were going on. But as I said, does this one have as much value? I'd say not, because the overseas doctors chapter is 4 pages in a 300-page book, and I know there were 16% of the workforce were from overseas in the 1980s. So really that works out to 30 to 40 pages worth if you were to do that as a thing. But this sort of like, it's othering Dr. Rushdie. You're almost like a token overseas doctor, and you'll carry 4 pages. But really that makes it irrelevant for me now, this book. So this book has become irrelevant for me. But in terms of other medical books, and we're not talking about doctors' lives or what they say, but in terms of the actual pure medicine and the art of the actual clinical examination, history examination findings, or that is always going to have some value, because that was the actual knowledge. And we're actually, the thing with medical knowledge is that it's always moving forwards with the advances in science. So it's always going to be usurped. That's why clinical guidelines come in. And that's why a lot of this book is irrelevant, because it's anecdotal about looking, as you said, looking down to tell you that sinusitis. I mean, you try doing that as a doctor now, no one will think that's noteworthy. I asked the patient to look down and tell me that was sinusitis. It makes no sense. Or I thought the patient was sick, but the pediatrician didn't, and the psychiatrist look at me, I'm a good doctor. So there's a lot of self-congratulatory behavior which the doctor doesn't tackle in this book, which makes it irrelevant. And that might be because whether they see certain personalities that resonate with themselves, so they don't want to rock the boat. But actually looking at it, you should be thinking, no, that is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. But instead, I just think you look like an impatient GP, and I don't agree with you. So the formulation of analysis and so on makes this book irrelevant, I think, for GPs in training or GPs who are actually current GPs.
Thank you, Fahim. I think it's been an evocative book, hasn't it? It's kind of brought out some negative emotions, to put it lightly. I think for me personally, I do think that I'm of the school of thought that would say that any medical book that's been written would have relevance regardless. Whether it's for the right or wrong reasons is a point for argument, but it kind of lets us fill in the gaps of our understanding of the past. I do think that the book let me understand how things developed over the years. Again, it was his narrative, and there was bits that he brought to it, and he embellished it in the way he embellished things. But it let me appreciate his point of view. It was a point of view that in some places I probably would agree with him, and in other places I would strongly disagree with him. But I think part of the conversation, I think in books in general, is to have people that maybe disagree with us and letting them have the opportunity to say those things, no matter how unsavory we find them or how distasteful we may find them. I think that's just a general point for me. I don't think he was right. I would say he was wrong in terms of what he said. But the fact that he said those things has value because it lets me understand how somebody of his class understood overseas doctors. It's been a bit of a shame because we've obviously discussed the BME and BLM issue. There was a lot more to the book, and I think we could agree to that from the historical perspective, how he talks about the NHS and its formation, which I do think has value. And I think personally, I think if I was recommending this book, so we'll just go to the star rating part. I do think there were bits in there that I think are useful for somebody who wants to know about how a GP's or the GP phenomena within the UK formulated. So for me, the star rating, I know you guys will probably be very much on the other spectrum. It'll still be a 4. And that's, again, because it was something that was mentioned to me by my trainer. It was something that was important then. It lets me understand, when I read this book, I understand a little bit about how doctors felt in those days and the challenges they faced. It does give me some feeling that maybe nowadays things are easier if you're a BME doctor. Maybe you guys disagree with that sentiment, but I think the fact that that book would not be written nowadays, I don't think that book would get published. It wouldn't make it to the publisher, not because of its, but I don't think, even an esteemed author, if they went to any publisher today, with whoever they might be, maybe one or two nefarious ones maybe would publish it, but any mainstream publisher would not publish that book nowadays. And I think that's a good thing because it shows that we've made some progress. There's still progress to be made, but we've made some progress. So I do think that there is value to the book. I know I dragged you two through this book and made you both read it, and I know you both love me for doing so. And I hope that for him, I know we've disagreed with it strongly over many weeks over this book, and how he basically said certain things and whatnot. But I do hope that in the fullness of time, and I think we do appreciate the book a bit more, whether it's because it's let us realize there's another book out of there 2018, or whether or not it gives us the opportunity to have the courage to step forward and actually do one ourselves. Because the only way I think at times to challenge these things is to actually put pen to paper, or to put your face in front of a screen and nod along and say things. And I think that's really a good thing, because it gives us the opportunity to actually say, well, you've said that and we appreciate what you've said it, but actually we disagree with you. And these are the reasons why. So I do hope that it gives us the opportunity to do so, because these things, negative things can inspire as well as positive things. So I think this has been a negative book in some aspects, and I hope that's inspired you guys and hopefully others as well. I'll let you guys say your rating. Fahim, do you want to say your rating?
Yeah, 2-star for this book.
Right.
Yeah. So so I wouldn't recommend it for someone else to read. I think I'm happy to give someone a summary of the book if they want, to save them the hours of reading this book. And I said it, if you want to read the other book in 2018 to get more up to date. So yeah, I think this one can be left in obscurity as it came to me.
Yeah, I think it's a high 2 out of 5. No, I guess the reason being, as you said, certainly we can't just use positivity to inspire. Certainly that there are negative things within this book, and if you put race to one side, there's still that kind of disconnect And it just reminds me of all those psychiatry letters that I've had to, not had to, but that I've actually read. And if you look at the detail and how they've referred to the patient, it's very difficult to digest. And some of the terminology, some of the language is very similar. And I have to stop and think, this is at a time when my dad just came to this country to practice medicine. So this is something that he had to face, whether he actually took it head on, or is it something that he had to actually just put his head down and try to break down those barriers. I don't know. I haven't had that conversation with him, but in terms of what I do with this book, I'm happy to post this to anyone.
Me too. Yeah. Another copy.
Yeah, you'll have to pay for postage, but
I'll pay that. I'll pay it. If anyone writes back wanting a copy of a book that's free, please let me know. I'll give it to them. Yeah.
But I think just bringing the I guess you made some allusion to it, didn't you, Zubair, about the next book?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
So this is a book called Between the World and Me. It's recently published, and it's something that I've been meaning to read, just because I guess I've got two boys, and there are certain topics that I have to address and speak to my kids about, and certainly this is something that he touches about, the issue of privilege and the issue of not having privilege, and how he communicates that to his son. So certainly, I thought it's something quite interesting to have a read. So see how you guys find it for next month.
Great. Excellent. I guess that's a wrap. Thank you for your time, as always. Speak to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.